$70. That was all Ethan Cole had left in this world. 70 crumpled, sweat-dampened dollars folded into a small plastic bag tucked deep in the pocket of his jeans. And now standing in the mouth of Storage Unit 4, 1-2 at the Pine Ridge facility on the industrial south side of Pittsburgh, watching the last of the professional buyers drive away in their warm trucks, Ethan understood with perfect clarity that he had just spent every last cent on garbage. The unit was 10 feet deep and packed floor to ceiling with sagging cardboard boxes, their sides dark and soft with mildew. A broken floor lamp lay on its side like a fallen soldier. Black plastic trash bags were piled in one corner, some split open to reveal stained, moldy clothing that hadn't seen daylight in years, maybe decades. The smell that rolled out of that concrete rectangle was a sickening cocktail of damp paper, biological decay, and time itself rotting from the inside out. Ethan stepped inside anyway. He had nowhere else to go. For the next hour, he dug through the wreckage of someone's forgotten life. Every box he touched simply collapsed the cardboard so waterlogged it had the consistency of wet bread. Inside each one was the same thing. Newspapers and magazines fused together into solid bricks of mold. Moth-eaten blankets that fell apart in his hands like tissue paper. Cracked dishes. Yellowed paperbacks with spines so brittle they disintegrated at the slightest pressure. There were no tools, no furniture worth saving, nothing that could be sold for even $1 at a roadside stand. Nothing. Ethan slid down the back wall of the unit and sat on the cold concrete floor. He pulled his knees up and buried his face in his gloved hands. The weight of his failure settled over him like a physical thing, heavier than the Pittsburgh winter, heavier than the years of homelessness, heavier even than the memory that lived behind his eyes every waking moment. He was 42 years old. He had served his country for 12 years. He had been a good soldier, a good sergeant, a man who believed in duty and honor and the system that bound them together. And the system had spit him out like a piece of gristle, and now here he sat in a storage unit full of garbage, completely broke with nothing to show for 4 decades of living except the clothes on his back and the dog pressed against his side. The dog. Ranger was a German Shepherd, 7 years old, with a thick coat of muted gray and silver that seemed almost luminous even in the dim light of the storage unit. He was a big animal, powerful in the shoulders and deep in the chest, but his temperament was one of profound stillness. Ranger did not pace or whine or demand. He simply existed, a living anchor tethered to Ethan by a bond that went deeper than language or command. They had been together since Ranger was a pup, and in the 3 years since Ethan had lost his apartment, his phone, his truck, and finally his last shred of connection to the world he'd once known, Ranger had never once left his side. Not once. The dog did not care that Ethan smelled like the street. Did not care that other people crossed to the far sidewalk when they saw them coming. Did not care about the diagnosis or the discharge papers or the nights when Ethan sat in the dark and could not stop shaking. Ranger cared about one thing: staying close. And that single wordless loyalty was the only reason Ethan Cole was still breathing. But now Ethan had failed even Ranger. The last of the kibble was gone this morning. There was no money left for more. And winter in Pittsburgh does not negotiate with the hungry. He was ready to give up. But that was not where this story began. It began 2 days earlier under a bridge on the south bank of the Monongahela River on a morning so cold that the air itself seemed to have frozen solid. The cold in Pittsburgh that January was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight. It pressed down from the iron-gray sky, radiated it upward from the frozen asphalt, and crept along the riverbanks carrying the smell of ice and rust and the ghost of an industrial age that had died decades ago but refused to be forgotten. Ethan felt it in the scar tissue of his left knee, a deep rhythmic ache that synchronized with his breathing like a second pulse. He sat huddled against a concrete pylon beneath the overpass, shielded from the worst of the wind, but not from the damp that seemed to live inside the cement itself. His shelter consisted of a blue plastic tarp stretched between the pylon and a shopping cart that contained everything he owned: a sleeping bag, a small cook pot, a handful of personal items that had survived 3 years of attrition. It was not much, but it was a place, a known quantity in a life that had become almost entirely fluid. That morning, a white municipal truck had pulled up to the bridge. A man in a thick city-issued coat climbed out and walked toward Ethan with the careful, apologetic gait of someone delivering bad news. He was not unkind, just firm. "I'm sorry, sir. New directive. We have to clear this area. Liability issues. You can't stay here. Ethan had simply nodded. He knew how to follow orders. He had been following orders his entire adult life. The difference was that the orders used to come with a purpose. Now they just came. He packed his belongings into the shopping cart and pushed it onto the sidewalk with Ranger walking at his heel. The sun was already beginning to dip and the temperature was dropping fast. The shelters were full. They were always full in January, and most would not take Ranger. Ethan would not abandon Ranger for a warm bed any more than he would abandon his own legs. They were a single unit. Where one went, the other followed. That was not negotiable. It was during that desperate walk along the riverbank that Ethan remembered the flyer. A damp, crumpled piece of paper he had picked up at a bus stop days earlier and shoved into his pocket without thinking. Pine Ridge Storage. Delinquent unit auction. Cash only. Storage auctions were a long shot dominated by professionals who knew what they were doing and had the trucks to haul it away. But sometimes people found things. Tools, furniture, things that could be sold at a pawn shop for enough to buy another week of survival. But first he needed shelter for the night. His eyes scanned the skyline across the river and landed on the Meridian Steelworks. The massive steel mill had been shuttered since the late 1980s, a monument to a dead industry. Acres of rusting metal, broken glass, and concrete canyons. Dangerous and strictly off-limits. But it was a roof. It took them nearly an hour to cross the bridge and navigate the crumbling service roads to the mill's perimeter. The chain-link fence was high, but near a collapsed loading dock, a section had rusted through at the bottom, leaving a gap just wide enough to crawl through. Ethan had to leave the shopping cart behind. He unfastened his pack and sleeping bag, and he and Ranger slipped through into the profound, echoing silence of the dead factory. The main foundry floor was a graveyard of machinery. Moonlight slanted through shattered skylights, illuminating hulking, silent shapes. It was colder inside than it had been on the street. The metal radiated a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. But Ethan found what he was looking for, a small brick building set apart from the main works, the sign above the door barely legible. Security office. The door was thick, the lock broken long ago, but the door was still on its hinges. Inside was a single room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. A heavy steel desk, a moldering chair. The window was filmed with grime, but not broken. The roof was intact. The floor was concrete, littered with dead leaves, but dry. Dry. Safe. It was enough. Ranger sniffed every corner of the room, performed his security sweep, then returned to Ethan's pack, circled twice, and lay down with a heavy sigh. He was home. The next morning, Ethan ate the last of his stale bread and divided the remaining kibble for Ranger. $73 in his pocket. Not enough for a room, too much to sit on while the cold closed in. He pulled out the crumpled flyer. Pine Ridge Storage. Delinquent unit auction. Cash only. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured, showing the paper to Ranger. The dog sniffed it and sneezed. "Yeah, it's a chance. The only one we've got." The Pine Ridge facility was a sprawling complex of identical gray buildings with bright blue roll-up doors. About 20 people gathered near the main office, mostly men with pickup trucks and cargo vans. They wore heavy coats and carried bright flashlights. They had the confident air of professionals. Ethan, in his worn leather jacket with Ranger at his side, felt the gap between himself and these men like a physical wall. He stayed at the back. Mason Griggs, the auctioneer, was heavy-set with a bright orange vest and a fast, rhythmic voice. He wasted no time. Locks were cut, doors rolled up, and the professionals moved with practiced efficiency. A unit of antique furniture went for $800. Tools and machinery climbed to $1,200. Ethan watched from the back, stroking Ranger's head, trying to ignore the growing certainty that he had no business being here. Then came Unit 412, last in the row, set apart. The lock was cut, the door groaned open. Professionals shined their lights inside for less than 10 seconds and turned away. One laughed, another shook his head and walked toward his truck. Which is how Ethan Cole became the only person standing in front of Unit 412 when Mason Griggs looked around and found nothing but empty air and one desperate man. "You with the dog, $20, it's all yours." And Ethan, because he had nothing left to lose, said 50. And a man walking away turned back and said 60 just for sport. And Ethan said 70. And the man laughed and waved his hand and disappeared. And Mason Griggs slapped his clipboard and said sold, and Ethan handed over every dollar he had in this world. And then Ranger refused to settle. The German Shepherd had been quiet throughout the hour of digging, sitting patiently near the entrance, watching Ethan work with those calm amber eyes. But now the dog stood. He walked past Ethan without acknowledgement, moving to the very back of the unit where a single large sheet of cheap plywood covered the rear wall. Ranger pressed his nose firmly against the wood. He sniffed once, twice, three times. Then he dropped to all fours and began to scratch at the base of the panel. It was not the excited scrabbling scratch of a dog chasing rats. It was focused, methodical, deliberate. Ranger, stop. Ethan's voice was tired and hollow. Leave it, boy. It's just rats. There's nothing back there for us. Ranger paused. He looked back at Ethan with an expression that, in 7 years, Ethan had learned to read as clearly as printed text. The dog was saying with absolute canine certainty, "You are wrong about this." Then Ranger turned back to the wall and scratched harder, letting out a low, insistent huff that echoed in the concrete box. Ethan sighed. His knee protested as he pushed himself to his feet. He owed the dog his attention. He had always owed the dog his attention. All right, all right. What is it? What have you got?" He walked to the back of the unit, his small flashlight beam playing over the plywood. It looked like nothing. Damp, cheap wood stained and peeling. But as the light traveled upward, something snagged in Ethan's mind. A detail his brain had filed away and dismissed. The water stains on the panel. They didn't spread and bloom outward like normal water damage from a leak above. They were perfectly straight. Two long vertical lines of discoloration running from ceiling to floor about 3 feet apart. Ethan ran his fingers along the lines. They weren't stains at all. They were seams. He wasn't looking at one solid sheet of plywood. He was looking at a section that had been deliberately cut and fitted between two other panels. And Ranger wasn't scratching because of rats. The dog had detected what Ethan's dulled senses had missed. A draft, a thin stream of cold air leaking through the gap between the fitted panel and the wall beside it. Ethan pressed his hand flat against the center of the panel. It shifted, not much, maybe a quarter inch, but enough. This was not a structural wall. This was a door. His heart gave a single hard jolt, the kind of jolt that a man who has stopped feeling much of anything recognizes as significant. He looked around the junk-filled unit and spotted a rusted tire iron half buried under a pile of rags. He grabbed it, returned to the wall, and wedged the flat end into the seam that Ranger had found. He put his shoulder into it. The plywood was damp and soft, and it gave way easily. He heard the dull tearing of wood fibers, ripping the faint protest of old nails pulling free. He pried the panel back, and it fell forward with a soft thud into the dust. Ranger, vindicated, pushed his nose into the opening, immediately sniffing the rush of cold, stale air that escaped from the darkness beyond. Behind the false wall lay a narrow, dark void, a man-made gap between the plywood and the true concrete block wall of the unit. The space was no more than 2 feet deep. It was an intentional, carefully constructed hiding place. And it was not empty. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through thick, swirling dust and landed on 3 objects sitting neatly on the concrete floor of the hidden space. They had not been tossed in. They had been placed, arranged with care by hands that understood the weight of what they were hiding. The first item was a small wooden box, dark, smooth, perhaps mahogany, about the size of a thick paperback novel. It was surprisingly light. The second was a large manila folder thick with papers. The flap was sealed not with glue but with a heavy circle of dark red wax stamped with an insignia he couldn't make out in the dim light. The seal was unbroken. The third item sat at the back of the void. Ethan had to stretch to reach it. It was a metal box, not a simple cash box from an office supply store. This was military grade, a flat black ammunition case with 3 high-quality combination tumbler locks securing the lid. It was heavy, serious, the kind of container designed to survive things that the people around it might not. Ethan pulled all 3 items out of the hidden space and set them on the grimy floor of the storage unit. The trash bags, the moldy magazines, the broken lamp, the $70 mistake. All of it faded into meaninglessness. This was not junk. This was a secret. Ranger whined softly and pressed his head against Ethan's arm, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in the man's body chemistry. The despair was gone. Something else had taken its place. Something electric and dangerous. "It's okay, boy," Ethan murmured, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what this is, but you found it." His first instinct was to open everything right here, right now. But a cold prickle of awareness ran up his spine. The unit door was wide open behind him. He was exposed. The facility owner had his name on a receipt. Anyone could walk by. This was not the place. He moved quickly. The wooden box and the sealed folder went deep into his backpack. The metal case was too large, so he wrapped it in his own sleeping bag, sacrificing his warmth for its concealment, and tucked the heavy bundle under his arm. He didn't bother looking at the rest of the unit's contents. He knew with absolute certainty that he had already found everything of value. He pulled the rolling door down to within a foot of the ground and kicked the plywood panel roughly back into place. It wouldn't survive a close inspection, but it would hide the void from a casual glance. The walk back across the city was a blur of heightened awareness. Every passing car, every distant siren, every figure on the far side of the street made the muscles in Ethan's neck tighten. The metal case under his arm was a constant, dangerous weight. Ranger walked in a tight, protective heel, his ears erect and swiveling, reading Ethan's fear with the precision of a seismograph. They crossed the bridge over the Monongahela as the last gray light faded from the sky. The Meridian Steelworks rose before them on the far bank, a massive skeleton of rusting steel and broken concrete silhouetted against the clouds. It had been their shelter for less than 48 hours, but already Ethan navigated the crumbling service roads and the gap in the chain-link fence with the familiarity of a man returning to his foxhole. Inside the old security office, he wedged the broken chair under the door handle and sat on the concrete floor with his back to the wall. Ranger settled at his side. Ethan clicked on his flashlight and propped it against the rusted desk, aiming the beam at the floor. He set the metal box aside. The 3 combination locks were impossible without tools and time he didn't have. He picked up the wooden box, ran his thumb over the smooth lid, then set it down too. He would save that one. He took the thick manila folder. He held it for a long moment. The red wax seal was brittle with age, cracked at the edges, but still intact. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and broke the seal with his thumb. It made a dry, brittle snapping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tiny silent room. Inside was a stack of folded papers. The top page was a letter handwritten in a spidery, faded blue ink. The penmanship was shaky, the loops and crosses of a person writing under enormous duress. Ethan angled the flashlight and began to read. "My name is Gerald Whitfield. If you are reading this, I am dead." The cold in the room seemed to deepen. "I have lived in fear for 29 years. I am a coward, and I pray God has mercy on my soul. But I cannot go to my grave without leaving this behind. I cannot let the truth die with me. What I have hidden here is the truth about my brother Daniel Whitfield. Danny. He was a good man, the best of us. He was murdered." Ethan stopped reading. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat. He looked at the flat black metal box sitting in the corner, its 3 locks catching the flashlight beam. Murdered. He looked back at the letter and read on faster now, his eyes racing across the shaky blue lines. Gerald, who called himself Jerry, wrote that his brother Danny had been an environmental activist in Pittsburgh, a local idealist who believed the city's industrial scars could be healed. In 1995, Danny had pooled every dollar he had to buy the abandoned Meridian Steelworks. He bought it because it was toxic, because it was a blight, because he believed he could clean the poison from the soil and build something meaningful for the community on the land. But Danny was not the only one who wanted that property. The letter named him, Warren Caldwell. Even Ethan disconnected from the city's affairs as he was recognized that name. It was etched into the sides of sleek new buildings downtown. It was on plaques at the University Medical Center. It was on glossy billboards promising luxury riverfront condominiums. Caldwell was not just a developer, he was the developer. The man who had reshaped Pittsburgh's skyline through 5 decades of relentless construction. A philanthropist. A pillar. According to Jerry's letter, Caldwell had wanted the Meridian land for a massive shipping depot, capitalizing on the river access. To build it, he needed the city to rezone the property from toxic industrial to commercial use. Danny Whitfield had found the proof of how Caldwell intended to make that happen. Falsified environmental reports, bribes paid to city zoning officials, a plan to build on poisoned ground that would endanger the health of an entire district. Danny the idealist was going to expose it all. The letter described what happened next in language that trembled on the page. A gas leak at Danny's small office in the winter of 1996. An explosion. An investigation that was opened and closed in less than a week. The official ruling was accidental death. The newspapers called it a tragedy. "It was not a tragedy," Jerry wrote. "It was an execution. I knew it, and they knew I knew." Jerry described how Caldwell's men came to him after the funeral. They were polite. They spoke of the city's future of progress, of how unfortunate it would be if Danny's young daughter Claire were to grow up without an uncle, as well as without a father. The threat required no elaboration. Terrified, Jerry had sworn he knew nothing about any evidence. Caldwell's lawyers forced him to sell the Meridian land. Jerry signed every paper they put in front of him. But he did one thing, one small, cowardly, defiant thing. He kept Danny's original deed to the property, the master title notarized and legally filed. He told Caldwell's people it had been destroyed in the office fire. He gave them copies, signed transfers, everything they demanded. But not the original. And alongside the deed, Jerry had kept everything Danny had collected. The fake permits, the bribery ledgers, the proof. He had locked it all in the metal ammunition case and sealed it behind a false wall in a storage unit he paid for with the last of his money month after month, year after year for 29 years. When the payments stopped, Jerry wrote it would mean he was dead, and the unit would go to auction. And maybe, God willing, someone would find it. The letter ended with words that burned themselves into Ethan's memory. I don't know who you are. Maybe you are just a stranger looking for treasure. Maybe you are God's answer to my prayer. If you have any courage, any decency at all, please do what I could not do. Don't let Danny's light go out. Get this to his daughter. Get this to the world. Ethan read the letter 3 times. Then he sat in the dark for a very long time, the pages resting on his knee, his hand on Ranger's warm flank. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, a metronome of calm in a room that had just filled with ghosts. Because Ethan knew this story. Not the names, not the details, not the specifics of land deals and bribery in Pittsburgh. But he knew the shape of it. He knew it the way a man knows the scar on his own body. He had lived this story before, 3 years and 7 months ago in a place hotter and dustier and 10,000 miles from this frozen steel mill. Ethan had watched his best friend die. Travis Ward, specialist Travis Ward, who laughed louder than anyone in the unit, who taped a photo of his wife Sarah and their newborn daughter Lily to the dashboard of every vehicle he drove, who talked about opening a small auto repair shop in Columbus, Ohio, with the certainty of a man who believed the future was a promise that could not be broken. Travis, who was checking the winch on a recovery vehicle when the hydraulic cable snapped and the lift mechanism failed catastrophically, and a multi-ton vehicle component crushed him before Ethan, standing 5 meters away, could take a single step. A week before Travis died, he had received a new photograph in the mail. Lily, 6 months old, sitting up on her own for the first time. Travis had carried that picture everywhere, showing it to every man in the unit, whether they wanted to see it or not, grinning so wide his eyes disappeared into the desert sun. Look at her, Cole. My little girl. She's waiting for me. He said it with the absolute conviction of a man who had never once considered that the universe might break its promises. Ethan remembered the sound of the hydraulic failure with a clarity that time had not softened. The hiss, the snap, the terrible metallic groan of the lift mechanism giving way. And then the half-second of silence, the fraction of eternity between the beginning of the fall and the end of everything, during which Ethan saw Travis look up with an expression that was not fear but surprise, as if the world had just violated a contract he had believed was ironclad. Then the weight came down. Ethan had filed his report. Faulty hydraulics, substandard parts from a low-bid contractor, multiple prior complaints that had been ignored. His report was clear, factual, and correct. Captain Ryan Mercer had produced a different report. Operator error. Travis Ward had failed to follow safety protocols. The contract with the parts supplier was deemed vital to operational readiness. The investigation was closed. Travis was buried, and so was the truth. But Ethan had not gone quietly. That was the part he carried like a stone in his chest. He had tried. He had written a formal complaint to Mercer's superior. The complaint was intercepted and never delivered. He had consulted a military attorney, a tired man who looked at the case file for 20 minutes, and then said with genuine sadness in his eyes that the maintenance records had been lost, and without physical evidence there was nothing to pursue. Ethan had even contacted a military journalist. The story was drafted. Then it vanished. The editor killed it under pressure from sources Ethan could not identify, and the journalist could not fight. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Each one ground away another layer of the man Ethan had been. The complaint taught him that the chain of command was a wall, not a ladder. The lawyer taught him that justice required evidence, and evidence could be made to disappear. The journalist taught him that the truth was only as strong as the institution willing to publish it. And by the time his discharge came through 6 months later, honorable on paper, but everybody knew what it really meant, Ethan was hollowed out. He had not lost his faith to an enemy's bullet. He had lost it to a signature on a false report in a system that protected its own machinery at the cost of the men who served inside it. The decline after that was not sudden. It was the slow, grinding erosion that men know but rarely talk about. The apartment went first, then the truck, then the phone, then the friends he was too ashamed to call, and eventually even the shame itself faded, replaced by a numbness that felt almost like peace if you didn't look at it too closely. The only thing he kept was Ranger, because Ranger did not know what shame was. Ranger did not ask whether Ethan deserved companionship. The dog simply stayed every day, without condition, and that stubborn, wordless loyalty was the rope that kept Ethan from sinking below the surface entirely. Now sitting in the frozen dark of an abandoned steel mill, reading a dead man's confession by flashlight, Ethan felt the two stories collide inside him with a force that made his hands shake. Danny Whitfield was Travis. Warren Caldwell was Ryan Mercer. And Jerry Poor, terrified Jerry, was the man Ethan had been for 3 years. The man who knew the truth and did nothing. The man who let the lie stand because fighting it had cost too much, and the odds were impossible, and the powerful always win. Except Jerry had done one thing. He had preserved the evidence. He had hidden it and prayed for someone braver than himself to find it. And a dog named Ranger had answered that prayer. Ethan opened the small wooden box. Inside, resting on faded velvet, were a child's crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands labeled Daddy and Me in a 6-year-old's wobbly letters, a small silver locket, and a stack of photographs. He pulled them out carefully. A young man with a kind, bright smile and unruly hair, Danny Whitfield, and in his arms a little girl with pigtails and laughing eyes, maybe 6 or 7 years old, Claire Whitfield. She would be a woman now in her mid-30s, a woman who had grown up believing her father died in an accident, a woman who never knew that her father's courage, his evidence, his entire legacy had been stolen from her and locked in the dark by a frightened man who loved her but could not protect her. Ethan looked at the photograph for a very long time. The smiling father, the laughing child. He thought of Travis Ward holding up the picture of baby Lily in the desert sun, grinning so wide his eyes disappeared. He thought of the auto shop that would never open, and the bicycle lessons that would never happen, and the little girl in Ohio who was growing up right now without knowing why her father never came home. He put the photograph back in the box. He placed the box and the folder in his backpack. He looked at the heavy, locked metal case. Then he looked at Ranger, who had been watching him the entire time with that steady, patient gaze. "Okay, boy," Ethan said. His voice was different now. The despair was gone. In its place was something harder, something with edges. "We're done hiding. We have a new mission." Ranger stood, shook himself once, and looked at the door. He was ready. Ethan did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the cold wall of the security office, one hand resting on Ranger's flank, the other holding the small flashlight aimed at the metal ammunition case in the corner. 3 combination locks. 3 barriers between the world and the truth that Jerry Whitfield had buried for 29 years. The locks were military grade, late 1980s or early 1990s, manufactured designed to resist exactly the kind of desperate, untrained tampering that Ethan might attempt with a tire iron and frozen fingers. He would need help. But help required trust, and trust required finding the right people, and finding the right people required information, and information required technology that a homeless man in a dead steel mill did not possess. First, though, he had to secure the objective. Before dawn, while the sky was still black and the temperature had bottomed out somewhere south of 10 degrees, Ethan wrapped the metal case in his sleeping bag and carried it deep into the main building of the Meridian Steelworks. Ranger padded beside him in absolute silence, navigating the debris fields and rusted machinery with the sure-footed grace of an animal that had mapped this terrain by scent and memory. Ethan moved with a soldier's economy, conserving energy, placing each footstep with care on the ice-slicked concrete. He found what he was looking for in a collapsed maintenance tunnel beneath the old foundry floor. A heavy, rusted iron plate set into the ground. He pried it up with the tire iron muscles burning and revealed a dark, dry crawl space beneath. He lowered the case inside, covered it with the sleeping bag, replaced the iron plate, and scattered dust and debris over the surface until it looked as though no one had touched it in 30 years. The sleeping bag was gone now. His only protection against the killing cold was Ranger. That night and the next, Ethan lay on bare concrete, while the big shepherd pressed his body against him, 40 kilograms of dense fur and steady warmth. The dog seemed to understand. He did not shift or roll away in the night. He simply lay there breathing slowly, a living furnace that kept the cold from taking what was left of Ethan Cole. But the cold was not Ethan's worst enemy during those days. His worst enemy lived inside his own skull. The decision to fight to take up Jerry Whitfield's cause and carry the truth out of the darkness had felt clean and certain in the moment he read the letter. But certainty is a fragile thing at 3 o'clock in the morning when you are lying on frozen concrete in a dead factory with no money, no phone, no allies, and a voice in your head that sounds exactly like Captain Ryan Mercer. You tried before Cole 3 times. You wrote the complaint, they buried it. You hired the lawyer, he gave up. You talked to the reporter. The story died. 3 swings, 3 misses. What makes you think this time will be any different? The voice was reasonable. That was its power. It did not shout or rage. It simply presented the facts with the same cold clinical precision that Mercer had used in that sterile room 3.5 years ago. The contract is vital. Your report is mistaken. You are dismissed, Sergeant. The voice knew Ethan's record. It knew every failure, every surrender, every time he had chosen silence over confrontation. Because the machine was too big and he was too small, and the gears would grind him up and spit out the pieces just like they had before. On the second night in the deepest trough of the darkness, Ethan spoke aloud, not to himself, to Ranger. "I'm scared, buddy." The words came out rough and raw, stripped of every pretense a man builds around himself to survive in a world that does not reward vulnerability. "I'm scared of trying again and failing again. You know what failure tastes like the first time it hurts. Second time you go numb. But the third time," he trailed off. Ranger lifted his head from his paws and placed his chin on Ethan's thigh. The dog let out a long, deep sigh, the kind of breath that carries the weight of absolute understanding, even though the creature drawing it cannot parse a single word of human language. And in that small sound, that warm exhalation against his leg, Ethan found something he had not expected. Not courage, something simpler. Permission. The dog had not abandoned him after 3 years on the street. Ranger had never once asked whether Ethan deserved loyalty. The dog simply gave it every day without condition. And if the question was not whether Ethan deserved a second chance, but simply whether he was willing to stand up, then the answer was the same one Ranger gave him every morning, with a cold nose against his palm and a patient look that said, "I am still here. You have to be here too." On the third morning, Ethan divided the last of their food, a handful of kibble for Ranger, nothing for himself. He fed the dog, watched him eat, and then said quietly, "Okay, let's go to work." The Carnegie Library in Oakland was a palace of sandstone and history, warm and dry, and smelling of old paper and floor polish. Ethan stood outside the ornate bronze doors and looked at the sign that read, "No animals permitted service, animals only," and felt his throat close. He had not been separated from Ranger for more than a few minutes in over 2 years. The dog was not just his companion. Ranger was the tether that held him to reality, the proof that he existed in the eyes of at least one other living creature. He led Ranger to a thick stone column near the entrance, partially sheltered from the wind. He knelt and looked the dog directly in the eyes. Those amber irises, calm and deep, watched him with total attention. "I have to go in, boy. I need you to wait here." "Can you do that? Can you wait?" Ranger let out a low, anxious whine and pressed his head hard against Ethan's chest. Ethan felt the dog's distress as if it were his own. He looped the leash around the column, his hands shaking. Then he stood and walked backward toward the doors, maintaining eye contact until the heavy glass panels closed between them. Inside the library, the warmth hit him like a wall. Students sat at long oak tables, their faces glowing in the light of laptop screens. Ethan felt intensely visible. His cracked leather jacket, his untrimmed beard, the grime embedded in the creases of his hands. He was a ghost at the feast, invisible on the street, but suddenly painfully conspicuous in this clean, quiet, civilized space. He kept his head down and found the public computer terminals in a quiet alcove at the back of the main reading room. He sat down, he flexed his cold fingers, and he began to hunt. The first search was for the victim. Daniel Whitfield, 1996 Pittsburgh. The library's digital archives were fast and thorough. Old newspaper clippings from the Post-Gazette appeared on the screen. Tragic gas leak claims local activist. Investigation rules accidental death. Community mourns Danny Whitfield. The articles were brief, clinical, and final. They painted Danny as a well-meaning but perhaps careless man who had been the victim of an unfortunate accident. The official narrative was exactly as Jerry's letter had described: clean, closed, buried. The second search was for the killer, Warren Caldwell. The screen flooded with results, decade after decade of glowing press coverage. The Caldwell Corporation pledges $5 million to Children's Hospital. Warren Caldwell honored as Philanthropist of the Year. New Caldwell Tower to reshape Pittsburgh's skyline. The man who had murdered Danny Whitfield had spent 30 years building a fortress of charity and civic goodwill around himself. He was not merely wealthy, he was beloved. He sat on hospital boards and university committees and received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the very city whose officials he had bribed. Looking at the screen, Ethan felt a cold sickness rising in his stomach. This was Ryan Mercer on a grand scale. Not just a captain covering up one death to protect one contract. This was a man who had built an empire on the foundation of other men's graves and been celebrated for it. The third search was the one that mattered. Claire Whitfield, Pittsburgh. Ethan scrolled through several pages of results. Obituaries, public records, social media profiles for people with the same name. He was about to refine his search when a headline stopped him cold. It was from a local community blog dated just 3 weeks earlier. Activist Claire Whitfield challenges Caldwell Corporation's new riverfront project. Ethan clicked the link. His heart was hammering. The article showed a photograph of a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the same intelligent, determined eyes as the little girl in the photograph. She was standing at a podium pointing at a projected map, her expression fierce and focused. The article detailed how Claire Whitfield, head of a community advocacy organization, was formally protesting the Caldwell Corporation's latest development project along the riverfront. She claimed the corporation's environmental impact studies were flawed and that they were ignoring significant health risks to surrounding neighborhoods. Ethan stared at the screen until the words blurred. She was still here. She was still in Pittsburgh. And she was already fighting Warren Caldwell. Danny Whitfield's daughter had grown up and without knowing it had taken up her murdered father's war. She was facing the same enemy with the same weapons, facts, and public pressure, while Caldwell held the hidden bloody advantage of knowing exactly what had happened to the last person who had tried to expose him. Ethan found her organization's website. There was a Contact Us page with a simple email form. He stared at it for a long moment, then closed the browser tab. An email was traceable, digital. It would leave a footprint that anyone with resources could follow. And Warren Caldwell had resources that Ethan could barely comprehend. He needed to do this the old way, the soldier's way. He walked to the library's small gift shop and used the last of his change to buy a single plain greeting card in a stamped envelope. He sat at an empty table in the main reading room, took a deep breath, and began to write. His handwriting was rough, slanted from years of military shorthand, but the message was brief and precise. Miss Whitfield, you do not know me. I have found something that belonged to your father, Daniel Whitfield, from 1996. It is a private matter of the highest importance. I believe it contains information he was trying to protect before he died. I cannot send it electronically. I cannot bring it to your office. It is not safe. If you wish to see this, you must meet me. He paused, thinking. She would assume this was a hoax, a scam. She probably received messages like this regularly, especially now that she was publicly opposing Caldwell. He needed proof that this was real. He opened his backpack and carefully took out the small wooden box. He removed one photograph, the clearest one, Danny holding 6-year-old Claire on his shoulders, both of them laughing in afternoon sunlight. He also took out one page from Jerry's letter, not the section about the murder, but a paragraph describing Danny's dream for the Meridian Steelworks, his vision of cleaning the poisoned land and building something for the community. He walked to the library's copy machine and made a single grainy photocopy of that page. He folded the photocopy and the original photograph into the card and continued writing. I will be at Shenley Park by the main fountain near the cafe this coming Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. I will be wearing a brown leather jacket and I will have a gray German Shepherd with me. Please come alone. He signed it simply, a friend. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to Claire Whitfield, care of her organization's office address, and walked out of the library. Ranger was exactly where Ethan had left him, A statue of gray fur shivering violently from the cold but utterly unmoving, his eyes locked on the library's front doors with the intensity of a creature whose entire world had just walked through them and not yet come back. The moment Ranger saw Ethan, the dog sprang to his feet, his entire body shaking with relief, pressing his head against Ethan's legs with a force that nearly knocked him over. Ethan knelt on the frozen sidewalk and buried his face in the dog's thick ruff. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. I kept my promise." He walked to the blue U.S. mail collection box on the corner. He held the letter for a moment, this small white rectangle containing a 30-year-old secret, and then slid it through the slot. The sound of it dropping into the dark interior of the metal box was barely audible. But to Ethan, it felt as final and irreversible as a trigger pull. The first move had been made. The 3 days between mailing the letter and the appointed Saturday meeting were a particular kind of hell. Ethan and Ranger hunkered down in the security office at the Meridian Steelworks, existing in a state of suspended animation. The old instincts of hypervigilance returned with a vengeance. He did not sleep for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. He sat with his back to the wall, listening to the wind howl through the dead factory, one hand always on Ranger's warm side. The dog was his metronome, his proof that time was still passing, that the world had not frozen around him entirely. But the worst part of those 3 days was not the cold or the hunger or the waiting. It was the conversation Ethan had with himself every night at 3 in the morning, the hour when the darkness is deepest and the will is thinnest. He replayed every failed attempt to get justice for Travis, the intercepted complaint, the sad-eyed lawyer, the killed story, and the voice in his head, calm and rational and merciless, asked the question that had no answer. Why would this time be different? You are the same man. You are weaker than you were then. You have less than you had then. You are nobody. You have nothing. Who will listen to you? And every morning at first light, Ranger would push his cold nose into Ethan's palm. The dog would look at him with those amber eyes, patient and steady, and the question would change. Not why would this be different, but can you stand up today, just this once? And Ethan would stand. Saturday arrived gray and merciless, the sky a low ceiling of bruised purple clouds. Ethan and Ranger reached Shenley Park an hour early. He found a position on a slight rise behind a stand of bare oaks 50 yards from the dry fountain, with clear sight lines to the parking area and the cafe. He settled against a tree trunk, Ranger beside him, and waited. At 1:58, a blue sedan pulled into the lot. A woman got out. Ethan's breath stopped. Claire Whitfield was taller than he had expected. She moved with quick, impatient energy, her dark wool peacoat buttoned to her chin, her hair pulled back tight. She walked to the fountain and stood with her arms crossed, scanning the empty park with an expression that was equal parts wariness and irritation. She looked exactly like someone who expected this to be a waste of her time. Ethan stepped out from the trees. Ranger moved at his left heel, a silent gray shadow. Claire saw them immediately. Her hand flew to her coat pocket. She took a half step backward. Suspicion came off her in waves. "Miss Whitfield?" Ethan stopped 10 feet away, one hand raised, palm out. "You're the one who sent the letter." It was not a question. Her eyes swept from Ethan's weathered face to the buist to the cracked leather jacket and back. She was calculating threat levels the way Ethan had been trained to do. "You said you have something of my father's. I don't have time for games. Do you know how many people have contacted me with so-called evidence since I started pushing back against Caldwell? Last week, someone sent me classified documents that turned out to be printouts from Wikipedia. The week before that, a man called me at 2 in the morning claiming he had proof. Turned out he wanted $500. Her voice was hard, professional. The voice of a woman who had been fighting alone for too long and had learned that hope was just another word for vulnerability. Ethan did not argue. He did not explain. He unzipped his backpack, reached inside, and pulled out the small wooden box. Then he took out the photograph. Danny Whitfield, young and grinning, holding his little girl on his shoulders in the golden light of a summer afternoon. He held it out to her without a word. Claire looked at the photograph, and the armor cracked. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she took the small, faded square. Her fingertips traced the image of her younger self, the pigtails, the open-mouthed laugh. Her father's hands holding her safe. "I don't have this one," she whispered. "I thought they were all lost in the fire." She looked up at Ethan, and the suspicion was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, a confusion so deep it was almost grief. "Where did you get this?" "It was with this." Ethan handed her the photocopied page from Jerry's letter. She unfolded the paper and read the shaky handwriting, the paragraph about Danny's dream for the Meridian Steelworks, his plan to heal the poisoned land. The color drained from her face. She put one hand on the cold stone rim of the fountain to steady herself. "Who are you?" she asked again. But this time it was not a challenge, it was a plea. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a veteran. I found these hidden in an old storage unit that went to auction. Your Uncle Jerry hid them there before he died." Uncle Jerry, the name seemed to wound her. "He told us everything was gone. He told my mother to leave Pittsburgh. He said it wasn't safe." "He was afraid," Ethan said quietly. "He was afraid they would come for you." "And my father," Ethan met her eyes. "The letter says he was murdered." Claire Whitfield turned away from him and stared at the dead leaves in the dry fountain. She was silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The emotion was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity that was more frightening than anger. "I knew it," she said. "I always knew. My mother knew too until the day she died. It was never an accident." She turned back to him. "Mr. Cole, you have stepped into something you do not understand." "I think I do," Ethan said. "It was a cover-up." "It is still a cover-up," Claire corrected. "I run a community advocacy group. For the last 6 months, I have been the primary opposition to Caldwell's new riverfront project, and they don't fight fair." She began to pace, rubbing her arms against the cold. "I've had strange clicks on my phone. My office has been broken into twice. Nothing was ever taken, but drawers were opened, files were moved. 2 of my biggest financial supporters pulled their funding last month, both citing unforeseen complications." She stopped pacing and looked around the empty park with a new expression on her face. It was fear. "Oh God," she breathed. "They're watching me. They must have seen me come here. They saw me meet a man they can't identify. They saw you hand me something." Ethan's training took over. His eyes swept the perimeter. The park was no longer a meeting place. It was a kill zone. "We need to move," he said. "You don't understand," Claire said, her voice rising. "You're in danger now. Both of you." Ranger, sensing her distress, let out a low, soft whine. "I have the rest of it," Ethan said, cutting through her panic. "The proof. It's in a locked metal box. I have it hidden. It's safe." This stopped her. Real proof. Ledgers, permits, the original deed to the Meridian Steelworks. Claire's eyes widened. The deed. That's why he could never fully develop it. The title was clouded. It's legally not his. "There's someone who can help us," Ethan said. "Someone you trust." Claire took a deep, shuddering breath. "There's one person. His name is Frank Garrett, ex-FBI." She started walking quickly toward the parking lot, and Ethan and Ranger fell in beside her. "He spent 2 years building a corruption case against city officials in 1999. The trail led straight to Caldwell. His investigation was killed from the inside. Supervisors transferred his team, classified his evidence, shut the whole thing down." "What did he do?" Ethan asked. "He resigned, but he's been waiting ever since. He hates Caldwell with a patience that scares me sometimes." She reached the car and paused, looking at Ethan with an expression he could not quite read. "But I should warn you, Frank doesn't trust easily. He's been burned too many times. He may think you're a plant. Then I'll have to convince him I'm not." "How?" "By showing him what's in the box." They drove across the city in Claire's sedan. Ranger sitting upright in the back seat with his chin on the edge of the window, watching the streets flow past with the calm attentiveness of a working dog on patrol. Claire gripped the steering wheel with whitened knuckles. Ethan gave her directions to the steelworks. They needed the box before anything else could happen. The Meridian Steelworks loomed against the evening sky like the ribcage of some enormous dead creature. Claire parked on the overgrown access lane behind a collapsed brick wall, out of sight from the road. Ethan retrieved the metal case from its hiding place in the maintenance tunnel, carrying it back through the dark factory floor with Ranger at his heels. They were 20 yards from the security office when Ranger stopped. The dog did not bark. He did not growl. He emitted a sound Ethan had heard only a handful of times in 7 years together, a low, almost subsonic rumble from deep in his chest, accompanied by a rigid tension through his entire body and a slow bristling of the fur along his spine. It was not a warning. It was a statement. There is danger here. Right now. Right in front of us. Ethan froze. Claire bumped into his back and opened her mouth to speak, but he raised one hand sharply and she went silent. Well, well. The voice came from the shadows to their left, smooth and confident, and not at all surprised. Look who came back. 2 men stepped out from behind a concrete pillar near the security office entrance, blocking the only clear exit path. They wore expensive wool overcoats unbuttoned over dark suits. The one who had spoken was in his 40s, clean-shaven, with a face that managed to look both bland and threatening at the same time. This was Nick Pratt. His companion was built like a commercial refrigerator. Younger, silent, with flat, watchful eyes that tracked movement the way a predator's do. This was Eric Bowman. Pratt was the mouth. Bowman was everything else. "That's far enough," Pratt said. He looked at Claire with a familiarity that made Ethan's blood chill. "Miss Whitfield, we've been wondering where you'd gotten to. Saw you at the park this afternoon. Making new friends, I see." His gaze shifted to Ethan and his expression took on the particular flavor of contempt that powerful men reserve for those they consider beneath notice. "And who's this your new consultant?" Ethan said nothing. He was assessing. Two men, one probable weapon, one exit blocked, one unknown. Claire behind him, heavy box under his arm. Not good. Pratt continued, his tone conversational. "We know about the Harrison funding withdrawal. That was us. We know about the office break-ins. Second time we cloned your hard drive, by the way, so thank you for that. And your friend here." He looked at Ethan with a small, cold smile. "Ethan Cole, Sergeant honorably discharged, PTSD, homeless, 3 years. The storage facility had your name on a receipt. We do our homework, Mr. Cole." The fact that they had investigated him, that they knew his name, his rank, his diagnosis, hit Ethan with a force he had not anticipated. He was not anonymous anymore. He was identified. He was a variable that had been measured and calculated and filed. "Here's the message," Pratt said, dropping the pretense of friendliness. "From people who matter. You are done, both of you. Forget whatever you think you found. Forget you met each other. You, Cole, crawl back under whatever bridge you came from. And you, Miss Whitfield, go back to your little advocacy group and find a different cause." He looked at Ranger, who had not moved an inch, but whose lip had curled back just enough to show the long white canines beneath. "Nice dog. Shame if something happened to it." Bowman's right hand moved slowly inside his coat. The moment stretched. Ethan's mind went cold and clear the way it always did when the situation demanded something beyond fear. He read Pratt's body language. Bowman's positioning the angle of the exit behind the two men, and he understood something crucial. They did not know about the box. If they knew the metal case existed and was in this building, they would not be standing here delivering threats. They would have come with more men, and they would not have announced themselves first. This was a warning shot, an intimidation play. They had followed Claire and found Ethan, and they were here to scare them both into silence, which meant the proof was still a secret. "We're leaving," Ethan said. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who has been threatened by professionals before and understands that showing fear only makes it worse. Pratt smirked and stepped aside. Bowman followed, creating a narrow corridor between them. They wanted Ethan and Claire to walk past them to feel the physical reality of being outmatched. Ethan locked his eyes on Bowman's hand inside the coat. He shifted the metal case to his opposite arm, shielding it with his body. Then he placed his free hand on Claire's shoulder and guided her forward. "Walk, don't run, don't look at them." They passed between the two men close enough to smell Pratt's cologne. Ranger walked backward, his eyes never leaving Bowman. His teeth still visible, a silent promise of violence that even the big man seemed to respect. They moved through the dark factory floor, footsteps echoing off the dead machinery, and out through the gap in the fence. The metal case went into the trunk of Claire's car. Ethan and Ranger got in the back. "Drive," Ethan said. Claire drove. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in her cheeks stood out like cables. "They were waiting for us." "They were following you," Ethan said. "Just like you suspected. But they don't know what we have. Not yet." "Frank," Claire said. "We go to Frank. Right now." Frank Garrett's office was in a nondescript warehouse in an industrial corridor, sandwiched between a plumbing supply company and a defunct tire shop. The sign on the door said Garrett and Associates Risk Management. Claire used a key to let them in through a side entrance. The interior was sparse, professional, and lit by the blue glow of multiple computer monitors. A man was waiting in the main office, standing near a window with a coffee mug in one hand. He was in his early 60s, African-American, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that cataloged everything they touched with the speed and precision of a barcode scanner. He wore a plain button-down shirt, no tie, and a shoulder holster that was visible when he turned. He looked like what he was. A man who had left the FBI but whose FBI training lived in his bones. "Claire," he said. He looked at Ethan, looked at Ranger, looked at the metal case in Ethan's hands. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation. "Frank, this is Ethan Cole." Claire said the words tumbling out fast. "He found it. He found everything my father hid. And Caldwell's people just intercepted us at the mill. Nick Pratt and Eric Bowman." Frank's expression hardened at the names. Pratt and Bowman, ex-cops both dishonorably discharged. They've been on Caldwell's payroll for years. He set down his coffee and looked at the box. Then he looked at Ethan with the flat, unblinking gaze of a man who has been professionally lied to more times than he can count. "And who exactly are you, Mr. Cole?" "I'm a veteran. I bought a storage unit at auction. The box was hidden behind a false wall." "Convenient." "Frank," Claire started. "No, let me finish." Frank turned fully toward Ethan. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Do you know how many times I've tried to nail Caldwell? I spent 2 years building a case. Names, dates, financial trails, the whole architecture of corruption. And every time I got close, someone on my own side shut me down. Transferred my people, classified my evidence, used national security as a broom to sweep a local corruption probe under the rug." He paused. "That kind of failure teaches you something, Mr. Cole. It teaches you that the other side plays chess while you're still learning checkers. And it teaches you that anyone who walks through your door with a gift-wrapped package might be carrying a bomb." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. He understood this man. The suspicion was not hostility. It was scar tissue. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to open the box. If it's empty, I'll walk out that door and you'll never see me again. If it's not, then you'll know what to do with what's inside, because I sure as hell don't." Frank studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to Ranger, who had completed a thorough perimeter check of the office and was now lying with his back against the front door facing outward, his head on his paws, his ears up. A self-appointed sentinel. "Your dog," Frank said. "He'd do that on his own. He does everything on his own. I just try to keep up." Something shifted in Frank's expression. Not trust, not yet, but the absence of active distrust, which in a man like Frank Garrett was practically an embrace. "Set it on the table," Frank said. Frank Garrett examined the metal ammunition case the way a surgeon examines a patient before the first incision. He turned it slowly under the light, running his fingertips along the seams, testing the weight distribution, studying the 3 combination tumbler locks, with an expression of professional respect. "This is serious hardware," he said more to himself than to anyone in the room. "Late 80s manufacture, military spec. Whoever locked this wanted it to stay locked." He looked at Claire. Your father was not playing around. He went to a workbench along the far wall and returned with a set of delicate tools that looked like they belonged in a watchmaker's shop, along with a medical stethoscope. He sat down, positioned the case in front of him, and placed the stethoscope against the body of the first lock. Then he began to turn the dial with the slow, precise movements of a man who had done this before and understood that patience was not optional. The room went still. Claire stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her knuckles white. Ethan sat across the table, his hands flat on the surface, watching. Ranger lay by the front door with his chin on his paws, eyes open, ears rotating slowly, monitoring every sound from the street outside. The only noise in the warehouse was the faint metallic whisper of Frank's tools and the soft rhythmic clicking of the combination dials. 5 minutes. 10. Frank's breathing was slow and controlled, his head tilted slightly, listening through the stethoscope for the nearly inaudible click of internal pins finding their gates. 1, he murmured. He moved to the second lock. More turning, more listening. The dial moved in fractions of degrees, clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise again. A quiet snick as the second tumbler dropped into alignment. The third lock was the most difficult. Frank worked at it for 12 solid minutes without speaking. His fingers made adjustments so small, they were almost invisible. Ethan watched Claire. She was barely breathing. Her eyes were fixed on the box with an intensity that went beyond curiosity. This was her father's legacy, the proof of his courage sealed away for 3 decades by a frightened brother who loved him but could not protect him. Whatever was inside that box would either validate everything Claire had believed her entire life or reduce it to ashes. Frank nodded once, a small, satisfied movement. That's 3. He released the latches. The internal locking bar disengaged with a heavy mechanical thud that seemed to vibrate through the table and into the floor. Frank looked up at Claire. "It's your history, kid. You open it." Claire stepped forward, Her hands were visibly shaking as she gripped the edges of the lid. She lifted it. The hinges were stiff, but they held and the lid swung back to reveal the contents. The air inside the box was dry and smelled of old paper leather and typewriter ink. Everything was perfectly preserved, sealed away from moisture and light and time itself. Frank began to lift the items out one by one, handling them with the careful deliberation of an archaeologist extracting artifacts from a dig site. The first item was a thick leather-bound journal. Claire opened it and made a small broken sound. Her father's neat technical handwriting filled the pages. Dates, names, observations, financial figures, all recorded with the meticulous precision of a man who understood that the truth was only as strong as the evidence supporting it. The second item was a heavy folder labeled Meridian Zoning Permits, 1995. Frank fanned the documents across the table. They all bore the official city seal. "These are the fakes," he said quietly, "the falsified permits that allowed the rezoning." The third was a pair of hardback accounting ledgers. Frank opened one and ran his finger down a column of entries. Shell company names, dollar amounts, dates of payment. A detailed, handwritten record of every bribe Warren Caldwell had paid to every city official who had helped him bury the truth about the Meridian land. The fourth item was a single document in a clear plastic sleeve. The original deed to the Meridian Steelworks, notarized and filed in the name of Daniel Whitfield. The legal proof that Danny had owned the land before Caldwell's lawyers had coerced Jerry into signing it away. And at the very bottom of the case, resting on a bed of foam padding, was a small black microcassette tape recorder. "My God," Claire whispered. "He recorded him." Frank picked O's recorder and turned it over in his hands. The cassette was still inside. He did not press play. "This needs to go to a forensic audio specialist," he said. "If this tape contains what I think it contains, it has to be authenticated, preserved, and handled with a chain of custody that will hold up in any courtroom in the country." He set the recorder down and looked at Ethan, then at Claire. For the first time since they had arrived, something close to a smile crossed Frank Garrett's weathered face. It was not a happy smile. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting in the dark for a very long time and had finally heard the sound of approaching footsteps. "We've got him," Frank said, and then Ranger moved. The dog lifted his head from his paws. He did not growl. He did not bark. He emitted a single high-pitched whine, almost inaudible, and then he stood up. The fur along his neck rose in a slow wave, and a low, threatening rumble began in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the front door. Ethan was at the dog's side in an instant. Frank was already moving, crossing the room in 2 strides to the small, dirty window overlooking the street. He peered through the edge of the blinds for 1 second, 2 seconds, then let the blind fall back into place. "Black sedan," Frank said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Parked across the street. Lights off. 2 occupants." He looked at Claire. "You were followed, or I was. Either way, Pratt and Bowman know we're here. They know we're together, and by now they've figured out we have the box." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "We split up," Frank said. He was already repacking the ledgers and the journal into the metal case, his movements fast and economical. "I take the box. I take my truck. They know the truck, they'll follow it. The box is the only thing they care about." He slammed the lid, and the latches clicked shut with a sound like a rifle bolt. "There's a service door at the end of the back corridor. Opens onto a different street. Ethan, you take Claire and the dog. Go out that way, quietly." "Where do we go?" Claire asked. Her voice was steady but thin. "Anywhere but home. Don't go to your apartment. Don't use your phone. Don't use a credit card. Go dark." Frank grabbed the case in one hand and his keys in the other. "I'm taking this straight to Chloe Hartley. She's the only attorney in this city that Caldwell can't by threaten or intimidate. She'll secure it." "How will we find each other?" Ethan asked. "Chloe will find a way. Now go." Frank moved toward the front door. Ethan grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her toward the back of the warehouse, Ranger padding silently at his heels. They heard the roar of Frank's truck engine turning over a defiant growl in the cold night. Almost immediately, another engine answered, the sedan accelerating hard, pulling away from the curb to follow the decoy. They burst through the service door into a narrow, lightless alley. The air hit them like a blade of ice. "He got them." Claire breathed a note of relief in her voice. "Not both of them," Ethan said. He held up his hand. "Listen." Claire froze. From the main alley came a sound that was not a car engine. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of footsteps. Someone running. a large man running hard. Bowman, Ethan whispered. Pratt dropped him off before following Frank. He's on foot. He's cutting off the back exit. Ethan pulled Claire into a dark gap between two buildings, a space filled with dumpsters and the smell of frozen garbage. They pressed themselves into the shadows. Ranger stood in front of them motionless as carved stone, his body coiled tight, not making a sound. The footsteps grew louder. Bowman ran past the mouth of their hiding place, his massive silhouette briefly blocking the faint light from the street beyond. He was heading toward the front of Frank's building, chasing the sound of the truck. Claire started to move. Ethan held her back with one hand. Wait. 10 seconds passed. Then, as Ethan had predicted, the footsteps returned. Slower this time. Bowman had realized his mistake. The truck was gone. He was doubling back, checking the alleys. They were trapped. Ethan knelt beside Ranger. He placed his hand on the dog's ruff and brought his mouth close to the pointed ear. His voice was barely a vibration. Ranger, see him go. Draw him off. Go, buddy, go. He pointed down the opposite fork of the alley, the one that led away from their position. Ranger understood instantly. The dog burst from the shadows like a gray projectile sprinting 20 yards down the far alley before stopping and unleashing a volley of deep booming barks that ricocheted off the brick walls like cannon fire. Bowman's shout was immediate. There, the dog. Heavy footsteps changed direction, pounding away from Ethan and Claire, chasing the sound that was already moving, already fading as Ranger led the big man on a chase through the dark industrial maze. Now, Ethan said. He took Claire's hand. Left. Walk fast. Don't run. Don't look back. They emerged from the gap and moved in the opposite direction, two dark figures dissolving into the larger darkness of the industrial district. Ethan set the pace. Not running because running draws attention, but walking fast with purpose, the stride of a man who knows exactly where he is going, even when he does not. Claire kept up. She did not speak. She did not ask where they were headed. In the space of a few hours, she had learned something about Ethan Cole that would have taken weeks to learn in any other circumstance. When the world contracted to its most basic elements, when the thin veneer of civilization peeled away, and all that was left was cold and dark and danger, this man operated. You followed him or you froze. There was no third option. They did not stop for nearly a mile. They crossed empty lots where frozen weeds crunched underfoot. They skirted the edges of darkened warehouse buildings, staying close to the walls where the shadows were deepest. They moved through industrial corridors where the streetlights had been broken or burned out and never replaced, districts that the city had forgotten the way the body forgets a limb that has gone numb. Ethan checked behind them every 30 seconds. There was no pursuit. Ranger had done his work. But the adrenaline that had kept them warm was fading now, leaking away like heat from an uninsulated room. And the brutal reality of a Pittsburgh January night closed around them like a fist. The temperature had dropped below zero. The wind came off the river in gusts that found every gap in their clothing and drove the cold straight to the bone. Ethan was worried about Ranger. The dog had sprinted into the dark to draw off a dangerous man, and there was no guarantee that Bowman had not caught him or that Ranger had not run into traffic or gotten lost in the maze of unfamiliar alleys. Ethan told himself that Ranger was smart, that the dog had survived 3 years on the streets and knew how to navigate urban terrain. But the rational part of his brain was fighting a losing battle against the part that could not bear the thought of losing the one creature in the world that had never given up on him. Then from the darkness behind them, the sound of paws on frozen pavement, fast light, rhythmic, and then a shape materialized out of the night gray and silver, moving at a steady trot. Ranger, the dog slowed as he approached, his tongue hanging his breath, pluming in the frozen air, but his eyes bright and his tail held high. Mission complete. Target diverted. Returning to base. Ethan dropped to one knee and the dog pressed against him, and for a moment the two of them existed in a private universe where the cold and the danger and the city itself simply did not matter. Good boy, Ethan whispered into the thick fur. Good boy. You did it. Ranger licked his face once, a rare gesture, and then turned and bumped his nose gently against Claire's gloved hand. The dog had decided in his own quiet way that this woman was now under his protection too. Claire stumbled on broken pavement and Ethan caught her arm. She was shaking so violently that her teeth were clicking together. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I can't, she stammered. My car, my apartment. I have nowhere to go. Ethan looked toward the river. The black skeleton of the Meridian Steelworks stood against the clouds. The last place they'll look, he said. We're going back to the mill. He led her through the darkness, back across the crumbling service roads, back through the gap in the fence, back across the debris-strewn factory floor that he navigated now from memory, without a flashlight, without hesitation. He did not need light. He knew this place the way a man knows his own body, every obstacle, memorized every path, tested every sound cataloged and filed. In the security office, he wedged the door shut, placed Claire against the most insulated wall, and went to work. He built a small fire in a rusted metal barrel, feeding it with dry wood from a broken pallet he had scouted weeks ago, and balled up shipping manifests from the old desk. The flame was tiny, barely more than a candle, but in the vast frozen darkness of the dead steel mill, it was an act of defiance against every force that had tried to put them in the ground. He heated water in a small blackened cookpot and gave Claire his last emergency ration bar, breaking it in half even though there was nothing left for himself. Then he told Ranger to lie beside her, and the dog, understanding the command, with the instinct of a creature that has spent its life reading human need, pressed his warm body against her legs and rested his heavy head on her knee. Claire sat in the glow of the barrel fire, the heat of the dog seeping into her frozen limbs, and looked across the flames at the man who had just given her everything he owned and kept nothing. She watched his eyes sweep the doorway every few seconds. She watched the calm set of his shoulders, the complete absence of panic. He had taken a cold, dark, abandoned room and turned it into a functioning shelter in less than 10 minutes. He had fire, water, food, and a security perimeter. He was not surviving. He was operating. "You knew exactly what to do," she said softly. "In the service," Ethan said, not looking up from the fire. "You learn to make a home out of whatever you've got. You learn to watch, and you learn to wait." Ranger sighed deeply and settled his weight more firmly against Claire's legs. The dog had not eaten since morning. Ethan had given the last of the food to Claire. And yet Ranger lay there without complaint, offering his warmth to a stranger because his human had asked him to. Claire looked down at the two, then back at Ethan, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, not gratitude. Something deeper and more permanent. She was seeing for the first time what a man with nothing looks like when he gives everything he has. The fire burned down to embers. Outside the security office, the wind had picked up, howling through the skeletal framework of the dead mill with a sound like a choir of ghosts. But inside the small brick room, there was stillness. There was warmth, fading but real. And there was the sound of breathing. 3 sets of lungs drawing and releasing air in the darkness. Ethan slowed and measured the breathing of a man standing watch. Claire's finally even the shallow rhythm of exhaustion, giving way to something close to sleep. And Ranger's deep and steady, the breathing of an animal that had positioned itself exactly where it was needed and would not move until told otherwise. In the quiet, Ethan allowed himself to think about what had happened. Not the tactical details, not the next move, not the threats or the evidence or the legal strategy. He thought about the fact that 24 hours ago he had been a ghost, a man with no name that mattered, no address, no phone number, no place in the architecture of society. He had been invisible in the way that only the truly destitute are invisible, present, but unseen, a human being reduced to a shape on a sidewalk that other human beings step around without making eye contact. And now a woman he had met that afternoon was sleeping 3 feet away from him, trusting him with her safety, trusting his judgment, trusting the instincts of his dog. A former FBI agent had looked him in the eye and decided against every habit of professional suspicion that Ethan Cole was worth betting on. A dead man's letter had called him God's answer to a prayer. He did not feel like an answer to anyone's prayer. He felt like a 42-year-old man sitting on a cold floor in the dark, hungry, tired, and scared. But he also felt something else, something that had been absent from his life since the day Travis Ward died, and the system closed ranks, and the truth was buried with military efficiency. He felt necessary, not useful, not tolerated, not pitied, necessary. The way a load-bearing wall is necessary, the way the foundation of a building is necessary. Remove it and everything above it falls. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. Claire stirred in her sleep. Ranger adjusted his position, pressing closer to her, and she settled again without waking. Ethan watched them both and made a promise in the silence of his own mind. Not a grand promise, not a vow of heroism or revenge or justice, just a simple, quiet commitment. I will not let this fail. Whatever comes tomorrow, whatever Caldwell sends, whatever the cost, I will not stop. Not this time. The cold crept back, And the three of them sat in the darkness of the dead steel mill, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of iron and ice waiting for the dawn. At 7 the next morning, Frank Garrett's gray van pulled up to the loading dock. He stepped out tired but alert and gave a short whistle. Ranger's ears shot up. Ethan nodded. He's clear. Frank had driven Pratt halfway across the state before losing him in the early morning traffic near the stadium district. The evidence was secure. The microcassette was all ready with a forensic audio specialist, and Chloe Hartley, attorney at law, had worked through the night. Her office was a quiet brownstone in a residential neighborhood, the kind of building that looked like someone's grandmother lived there until you noticed the security cameras in the reinforced door frame. The brass plaque read, C.L. Hartley, attorney at law. Chloe opened the door herself. She was in her late 40s, of Asian descent, wearing a gray suit that fit like it had been engineered rather than sewn. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. Her expression gave away nothing. Her eyes gave away everything. They were the eyes of a woman who processed information the way a computer processes code, fast, thorough, and without sentiment. She looked at Ethan, then at Ranger. He's well behaved, I trust. He's a guard, Ethan said, not a pet. Good. The conference room was large and cool, dominated by a polished mahogany table. The metal ammunition case sat in its center like a relic in a museum. A man was standing by the window with a coffee cup, younger than Ethan had expected, mid-30s, with a rumpled shirt and the restless energy of someone who had been awake all night by choice rather than necessity. This was Jake Brennan, investigative reporter. Jake looked at the box, then at Ethan, then at Claire. His expression was skeptical in the way that only a journalist's can be, the skepticism of a man who has heard 1,000 incredible stories and found exactly none of them to be true. I need more than old paper and a dead man's diary, Jake said. Caldwell has a legal team that will turn those ledgers into confetti and deposition. Chain of custody alone will be a nightmare. There's a tape, Ethan said. Danny Whitfield recorded a conversation with Warren Caldwell 3 days before he was killed. Jake set down his coffee very slowly. A tape. Authenticated this morning by Dr. Helen Reed at Carnegie Mellon, Chloe added. Voice print analysis confirms 2 speakers, Daniel Whitfield and Warren Caldwell. The content is exactly what Jerry Whitfield's letter describes, a discussion of the cover-up, an implicit threat. Jake Brennan sat down. The story had just changed from interesting to historic. Chloe laid out what she had discovered overnight. Using names from Danny Whitfield's journal, she had made calls. Dozens of calls, working through the small hours of the morning with a pot of black coffee and the methodical persistence of a woman who understood that legal cases are built not from dramatic revelations, but from the patient accumulation of facts. Danny was not the only death connected to Caldwell's operations. 6 other men had died in accidents on Caldwell-related construction sites between 1996 and 1998. A welder named Thomas Briggs, who had reported structural deficiencies at a Caldwell high-rise and died in a scaffolding collapse 3 weeks later. A city inspector named Robert Hale, who had flagged irregularities in a Caldwell permit application and was found dead in what was ruled a single car accident on a straight, dry road. A union representative named James Fenton, who had organized a safety walkout at a Caldwell excavation site and was killed by a piece of heavy equipment that had, according to the official report, rolled off its blocks due to operator error. All of them ruled accidental. All of them involving men who had raised safety or environmental concerns about Caldwell projects. All of them investigated briefly and closed permanently. Chloe had already been in contact with a representative for 3 of those families, a woman named Anna Shelton. Anna was the widow of James Fenton, the union man. She had spent 15 years writing letters to prosecutors, to journalists, to politicians, to anyone who would listen, trying to get someone to look at the pattern of deaths on Caldwell's job sites. No one had. The letters went unanswered. The phone calls were not returned. Eventually, even her own family had told her to let it go, to move on, to accept that James was gone and that no amount of letter writing would bring him back. But Anna Shelton had not let it go. She had kept every letter, every document, every unanswered email in a filing cabinet in her basement, organized by date and recipient, waiting for the day that someone would finally ask to see them. She cried on the phone, Chloe said, with the particular flatness of voice that very controlled people use when they are trying not to show emotion. She said she thought she would die without anyone knowing what really happened to her husband. She said she had prayed every night for 15 years. And then she asked me if this was real, if it was actually happening. And I told her yes, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "Thank God." The room was silent. Ethan thought of Travis Ward. He thought of Sarah Ward in Columbus putting Lily to bed every night, carrying the weight of an unanswered question that the military had sealed shut with a stamp marked accidental. He wondered how many Anna Sheltons there were in the world, how many filing cabinets in how many basements filled with letters that no one had read, waiting for a truth that might never come. The phone call from Caldwell's lawyer came at 9:30. Martin Cross, polished and precise, requesting an informal meeting to discuss the return of certain archival materials. His voice through the speakerphone was as smooth as oiled glass, the voice of a man who resolved problems the way mechanics resolve engine trouble, with money and pressure applied in the right places. Chloe agreed. Her office, 10 o'clock. Caldwell in person. "He wants to know what we have," Frank said after the call ended. "He wants to buy us off," Claire said, her jaw tight. "He wants both," Ethan said quietly, "and he wants to look us in the eye while he does it." They arrived at 10 precisely. Warren Caldwell walked into the conference room the way a man walks into a building he owns. He was 80 years old, but the age showed only in the white of his hair and the careful deliberation of his movements. His suit was dark, custom-tailored, and fit him with the precision of a military uniform. His eyes were calm, almost benevolent, the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making people feel comfortable in his presence, while he decided their futures without their knowledge or consent. Behind him came Martin Cross, the lawyer, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than everything Ethan had owned in his entire life. And behind Cross came a younger man, late 20s, in a sharp modern suit with nervous, darting eyes. This was Kyle Caldwell, the grandson, the heir apparent. He did not look like a conspirator. He looked like a man who had just been told that the building he lived in was on fire and had not yet decided which direction to run. Ethan stared at Warren Caldwell across the mahogany table. He saw the kind eyes, the confident posture, the immaculate suit. And all he could see was Captain Ryan Mercer. The same practiced calm, the same absolute certainty that power entitled a man to decide who lived and who died and who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. Ranger, lying under the table at Ethan's feet, let out a single low growl. The dog felt what Ethan felt, the presence of a predator. Cross opened it off the thick offer, $8 million for what he called personal effects, plus a full confidentiality agreement. He presented it as generosity, as compassion, as the reasonable resolution of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Claire's voice was clear and steady. "My father's memory is not for sale." Caldwell smiled. It was a patient, patronizing smile, the smile of a man who had been saying yes to himself for so long that the word no had become a foreign language. "My dear, this is a 30-year-old misunderstanding. Papers get lost, stories get confused. This is a chance for everyone to walk away whole." "No one walks away from this whole, Mr. Caldwell," Chloe said. She slid a copy of Danny Whitfield's journal across the table. Cross scoffed. "Circumstantial. The writings of a dead man. It won't hold." And then Warren Caldwell leaned forward and showed them what 80 years of unchallenged power looks like when it decides to push back. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was no longer grandfatherly. It was cold, precise, and absolutely certain. "I know who you are. You're a solo practitioner working out of a brownstone. Do you honestly believe you can sustain a legal battle against my firm? I will bury you in motions and depositions for the next decade. You will be bankrupt before you see the inside of a courtroom." He turned to Claire. "And you're betting your little community group on a box of moldy papers. I can make every remaining donor you have disappear in a week. I've done it before." His eyes found Ethan. The benevolence was gone. What replaced it was something cold and surgical. "And you, the soldier, the homeless veteran with PTSD, who is going to believe your testimony, who is going to put you on a witness stand and expect a jury to take you seriously." The words hit Ethan like a fist, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Or at least they had been true once, in a sterile room that smelled of floor cleaner, when a man with a granite jaw had looked at Ethan and said the same thing in different words. "Your report is mistaken. You are dismissed." For one terrible moment, the old darkness surged. The voice of Mercer, the taste of failure, the absolute certainty that the machine was too big and he was too small. And then Ranger pushed his cold, wet nose against Ethan's hand under the table. A small touch, invisible to everyone else in the room, But it was a tether to the present, a reminder that he was not in that sterile room anymore, that Mercer was 1,000 miles away and years in the past, and that the man sitting across the table was not a titan. He was a frightened old man in an expensive suit, surrounded by lawyers, because lawyers were the only thing standing between him and 30 years of buried truth. Ethan looked at Caldwell, and this time he did not see Mercer. He saw fear. Chloe's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Perhaps I am just a solo practitioner, Mr. Caldwell, but Anna Shelton is not. The name landed on the table like a grenade. Kyle Caldwell flinched. Cross stopped smiling. Anna Shelton, Chloe continued, represents the families of 6 other men who died on your construction sites between 1996 and 1998. She has been trying to get someone to listen to her for 15 years. She is very eager to have her day in court. And then there's Mr. Brennan, Chloe said, nodding toward the reporter in the corner, who I understand has already drafted a rather comprehensive article. And finally, Chloe said, there is the tape. The room went absolutely still. The tape recording of your meeting with Daniel Whitfield, authenticated this morning by forensic analysis, in which your voice, Mr. Caldwell, can be clearly heard discussing the cover-up of environmental violations on the Meridian property, 3 days before Daniel Whitfield was killed. Warren Caldwell stared at Chloe. The mask was gone. The philanthropy, the hospital wings, the Lifetime Achievement Awards, all of it stripped away in the space of a single sentence. What remained was the face of a man who had built his empire on graves and had just learned that the dead could speak. But he did not surrender. His jaw tightened. His eyes swept the room, calculating, searching for leverage, for an angle, for the weakness that would let him turn this back in his favor, the way he had turned everything in his favor for 50 years. It was Kyle Caldwell who broke. The grandson stood up. His face was white. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles had gone translucent. He was not looking at the past. He was looking at the stock ticker. Grandfather, his voice was low and urgent, I won't allow this. This is my company too, my future. If that story runs, the Caldwell name is toxic. Our stock will be worthless by noon. Every partner, every investor, every contract we have will evaporate. This isn't a lawsuit. This is an extinction event. Be quiet, Kyle. No. The word came out sharp and hard the first time Kyle Caldwell had ever said it to the old man. He turned to Chloe, not with remorse, not with conscience, with pure, cold mathematical pragmatism. What do you want? Chloe folded her hands on the table. A full public acknowledgement of the Caldwell Corporation's role in the safety violations and the cover-up that resulted in the deaths of Daniel Whitfield and 6 other men. The establishment of a $20 million compensation fund for the victims' families, and a $30 million endowment for a new city foundation for workplace safety named after the victims. Impossible, Cross said. It's that, Jake Brennan said quietly from his corner, or my story runs on the front page tomorrow morning. Your choice. Kyle looked at his grandfather. Control the damage, sir. It's the only move we have. Warren Caldwell sat back in his chair. He looked at Ethan, at Claire, at Frank, at the box on the table, at the 30 years of buried truth that had finally clawed its way into the light. His eyes were no longer kind. They were no longer calculating. They were filled with something that Ethan recognized because he had seen it in Mercer's eyes on the day Ethan filed his complaint. It was the hatred of a man who has been caught and knows it and cannot forgive the people who caught him. Draft the agreement, Caldwell said to his lawyer. His voice was flat and dead. We'll sign. The pen touched paper. The signature was angry sharp, the penmanship of a man who was not repenting, but abdicating. It was not justice in the way that movies show justice with tears and apologies and the triumph of the righteous. It was justice the way it actually works. Slow, grinding, transactional, and deeply unsatisfying to everyone except the dead who cannot be satisfied at all. Caldwell and his people left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed louder than any of the words that had been spoken in the last hour. Jake Brennan looked at the group. It runs tomorrow, he said, front page. The next morning, the city of Pittsburgh woke to a different world. The silence that followed Warren Caldwell's signature was heavier than any sound that had come before it. It was the silence of a 30-year-old weight settling of a fault line, finally releasing the pressure it had stored since 1996. Caldwell and his people left the conference room without a word. Kyle was already on his phone in the hallway, his voice a low, urgent monotone speaking the bloodless language of damage control and managed narratives. Martin Cross walked with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man who has just realized that his most important client is also his most dangerous liability. And Warren Caldwell himself, the titan, the philanthropist, the man whose name was carved into the stone of half the public buildings in Pittsburgh, walked out like what he truly was, a frail, bitter old man who had been beaten not by justice, but by arithmetic. The headline in the Post-Gazette was printed in bold black type across the full width of the front page. The Meridian Betrayal. Caldwell admits 30-year cover-up, 7 deaths linked to fraud. Jake Brennan's article was a masterwork of investigative journalism, meticulously sourced and carefully structured. It told the story of Danny Whitfield, an idealist who had tried to clean a poisoned piece of land and had been murdered for it. It told the story of 6 other men whose deaths had been ruled accidental and whose families had spent years shouting into a void. It told the story of Jerry Whitfield, a frightened man who had preserved his brother's evidence in a hidden box and prayed for someone to find it. And it told the story of a homeless veteran and his dog who had bought a storage unit for $70 and changed the course of a city's history. Ethan read the article on a bench in the cold morning air, the newspaper bought with a $5 bill that Frank Garrett had pressed into his hand. Ranger sat at his feet, watching the city come alive around them with his usual calm attention. Ethan looked at the photograph of Warren Caldwell on the front page, the same benevolent smile that now looked less like philanthropy and more like a mask. He thought of Captain Ryan Mercer. He thought of Travis Ward buried with a lie on his record. He thought of Sarah Ward in Columbus, raising Lily alone, not knowing why her husband had really died. He felt no joy, no triumph, just the quiet, heavy click of a lock finally falling into place. The end of a war he hadn't known he was still fighting. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The Caldwell Corporation's stock collapsed within hours of the story's publication. The city council convened an emergency session to review every contract, every permit, every deal that Caldwell had ever signed with the city of Pittsburgh. The university announced it would remove the Caldwell name from its medical research wing. The Children's Hospital followed suit the same afternoon. The empire that Warren Caldwell had spent 50 years building, the towers and the plazas and the gleaming monuments to his own greatness, began to crumble under the weight of 7 names that had been silent for 30 years and were finally irrevocably being heard. Weeks passed, the sharp, killing cold of January softened into the wet gray cold of February, and then into the first tentative hints of March, when the ice on the Monongahela began to break apart, with sounds like distant gunshots, and the patches of brown grass along the riverbank showed the faintest, most tentative promise of green. It was the kind of green that only people who have survived a very hard winter can fully appreciate the color of a world, remembering that it knows how to grow. Ethan and Ranger remained at the Meridian Steelworks. It was still their shelter, still their fortress, but it felt different now. The quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of abandonment, the dead quiet of a place that the world had given up on. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a held breath before the first note of a song. The legal proceedings moved with the grinding, inevitable slowness of institutional machinery. There were depositions and filings, and motions and counter-motions. Martin Cross Caldwell's lawyer attempted twice to have the settlement agreement voided on technical grounds, and twice Chloe Hartley demolished his arguments with the precise, devastating efficiency of a woman who had anticipated every possible objection before her opponents had even thought of them. The compensation funds were released in stages. Anna Shelton was the first to receive her settlement. She called Claire that evening and they spoke for 2 hours. Frank and Claire visited regularly, bringing food supplies, and for Ranger, heavy bags of premium kibble. The hollow-eyed hunger that had defined their existence for 3 years was gone. Ethan ate full meals. Ranger's coat grew thick and lustrous. The security office, once a bare concrete cell, gradually acquired a kerosene heater, a proper sleeping pad, a small folding table. It was not a home, not yet, but it was no longer just a place to survive. It was a place to plan. On a bright afternoon in March, with the sun casting long shadows across the rusting yard, Claire Whitfield arrived at the mill with an energy that Ethan had not seen in her before. She found him reinforcing the security office door, a task he was performing with the meticulous, practiced skill of a man who understood that maintenance was not a chore, but a discipline. "Ethan," her voice was bright. He looked up. Ranger trotted over and greeted her with a respectful nudge of his nose against her gloved hand. "The settlement is finalized," Claire said. "All of it. The compensation funds have been distributed to the families. Anna Shelton called me this morning. She was crying. She said she never thought she'd live to see it. That's good, Ethan said. That's right. And the land. Claire looked around the vast, rusting expanse of the steelworks. The place where her father had dreamed of building something beautiful on top of something poisoned. The Meridian property, the original deed held up. It's mine, Ethan. Legally, irrevocably mine. She took a deep breath. The developers had already come calling, she told him. They saw acres of prime riverfront real estate. They were offering fortunes. You're going to sell, Ethan said. It was the logical move, the practical move, the move that anyone with any sense would make. No, Claire said. And the way she said it, the fierce, bright certainty in her voice reminded Ethan so powerfully of the man in the photographs, the young idealist with the bright smile and the unruly hair, that for a moment he could not speak. I'm going to finish what my father started. She laid out her plan. She would use the settlement money, the money that Warren Caldwell had paid under his own name, in his own handwriting, to redevelop the Meridian Steelworks. Not luxury condominiums, not office towers, not another monument to someone's wealth. Affordable housing for working families, a public green space on the riverfront, a community support center with job training and childcare, and a dedicated wing for veterans support services. A place for men and women who had served their country and been discarded by the system they served. A place where they could find medical care, job placement counseling, and the simple, fundamental dignity of being treated like human beings instead of problems to be managed. But I can't do it alone, Claire said. She turned and looked directly at Ethan. It's a massive project. I need someone to manage this site. Someone who knows this place, who knows its bones. Someone who knows how to build something from nothing. How to keep things running. How to keep people safe. She took a step closer. I need someone I trust. Ethan looked down at his hands. Calloused, scarred, dirt embedded so deeply in the creases that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove it. The hands of a man who had not held a paycheck, a purpose, or a place in the world for 3 years. Claire, I'm a homeless man. I don't know anything about... Stop. Her voice was firm but not unkind. Don't you dare finish that sentence. I am not offering you charity, Ethan. I am offering you a job. She touched his arm. I will never forget that night. In the alley, in this room. I'm an activist. I'm used to fighting with words, with petitions, with public pressure. But when we were in real danger, when I was freezing and falling apart, you were the one who took command. You built a fire. You secured the perimeter. You fed me. You put your dog next to me so I wouldn't freeze. You gave me everything you had, and you kept nothing for yourself. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less certain. My father was a man who believed you could take something broken and make it whole. He believed it about this land. He believed it about this city, and I think if he had met you, he would have believed it about you too. Not because you need fixing, Ethan, because you are the proof that he was right, that the broken things are the ones worth saving. She straightened. I am offering Sergeant Ethan Cole the position of Head of Management and Maintenance for the Meridian Community Project. Full salary, benefits, housing on site. And before you say anything about qualifications, let me remind you that you kept 2 people and a dog alive through a Pittsburgh winter night in an abandoned building with nothing but a barrel, some scrap wood, and a ration bar. That is the kind of qualification that no university on earth can teach. Ethan looked at her. He looked at his hands again. And he thought about what those hands had done. They had failed to save Travis Ward. They had signed discharge papers. They had pushed a shopping cart down frozen streets. But they had also pried open a false wall. They had carried a metal box through the darkness. They had built a fire in a dead room to keep a stranger warm. They had scratched a dog's ears at 3 in the morning when the voice in his head said, "Give up," and the dog's eyes said, "Stay." He felt a burning sensation behind his eyes. The kind of sensation that a man who has not cried in years does not immediately recognize. I accept, he said. 6 months later, the Meridian Steelworks was unrecognizable. Where silence had lived for decades, bulldozers roared, and construction crews shouted to each other across the rising framework of new buildings. The rusted, dangerous sections of the old mill were coming down, but the strong brick bones, the foundations that had been built to last by men who understood that some things are meant to stand, were being preserved and rebuilt. New walls rose from old foundations. New windows let light into spaces that had been dark for 30 years. Ethan Cole stood at the window of his office. It was the same room, the security office, the 10 by 10-foot concrete cell where he had slept on bare floors and burned pallet wood in a barrel to stay alive. But it was not the same room. The walls were finished with clean white drywall. The floor was new tile. A blueprint of the entire community project was spread across his desk, marked with his notations in neat, precise handwriting. A small embroidered patch on his navy blue work shirt read, Meridian Community. He was leaner than he had been in the winter. His face was still weathered, still marked by the years, but the deep, haunted lines of despair around his eyes were gone. His hair was cut short. The silver at his temples looked like distinction rather than decay. He stood straight. He moved with purpose. He looked like a man who had a reason to get out of bed in the morning and knew exactly what that reason was. The sound of nails clicking on new tile made him turn. Ranger padded into the office. His coat was thick and brushed, his body filled out with months of proper nutrition. He walked to Ethan and rested his heavy head on his hand, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times before in rain and cold and darkness and fear. The same gesture, but the hand that received it was no longer the hand of a man trying to survive. It was the hand of a man building something. Time for our walk, buddy. They left the office together and walked out into the late afternoon sun. Their apartment was on the second floor of the newly renovated administrative building. It was small, 2 rooms, but the heat worked, the refrigerator was full, the bed was clean and soft and dry, and on the wall above the bed hung a framed photograph, the one from the wooden box Danny Whitfield holding his daughter on his shoulders in the golden light of a summer afternoon. Claire had given it back to Ethan. "You found it," she had said. "It belongs with you." The construction crew was finishing for the day, packing up their tools, calling out goodbyes across the yard. The framework of the new community center rose against the sky steel beams and fresh concrete, and the promise of something that had waited 30 years to be born. The Veteran Services Wing would be named for Travis Ward. Ethan had written to Sarah Ward in Columbus to tell her. She had written back a single line on a plain white card in a hand that shook as badly as Jerry Whitfield's. "Thank you for not forgetting him." Ethan and Ranger walked the perimeter of the site, their daily patrol past the new gate where the broken fence used to be. A sign hung above it, Meridian Community Project, built on the foundation of truth. They stopped at the old loading dock, the same spot where Ethan had first slipped through the gap in the chain-link fence on a frozen January night, with nothing in the world except a backpack full of rags and a dog who refused to leave his side. The loading dock was rebuilt now. New concrete, new steps, new railings painted a deep blue that matched the color of the river on clear days. But the view was the same, the slow, dark curve of the Monongahela, the bridge they had crossed in the freezing dark with stolen evidence under one arm and a prayer on silent lips. The city skyline in the distance, its towers glinting in the late afternoon sun, and somewhere among them the buildings that still bore the scars where the Caldwell name had been chiseled off the stone. On the far bank in the spot where Ethan and Ranger had once huddled under a bridge, a new park bench had been installed by the city as part of an expanded outreach program for the homeless. Ethan had seen it on one of his walks. He had stood there for a long time looking at the bench, remembering the concrete and the cold and the way the wind had cut through every layer of clothing he owned. He had not cried, but Ranger had pressed against his leg with unusual intensity, as if the dog too remembered what that place had meant and was saying in the only language he knew that they did not have to go back there ever again. Ethan sat down on the top step. Ranger lay beside him and placed his head on Ethan's thigh. The same position, the same weight, the same warm, steady breathing. But this time the ground beneath them was not a place they were hiding. It was not a place they were surviving. It was a place they had built. A place that existed because a dog had scratched at a wall and a man had decided one more time to stand up. Ranger let out a long, deep sigh, the kind of sigh that a dog makes when every sound is familiar. Every scent is safe and the person beside him is exactly where he belongs. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's broad head. He thought of Danny Whitfield, who had dreamed of this place. He thought of Jerry Whitfield, who had been too afraid to fight but brave enough to hide the truth. He thought of Frank Garrett, who had waited 15 years for a second chance and used it without hesitation. He thought of Claire, who had inherited her father's courage without ever knowing its source. He thought of Travis Ward, whose name would soon be on the wall of a building dedicated to helping people like the man Travis had wanted to become. And he thought of the $70, the last money he had in the world spent on a unit full of garbage that turned out to hold everything that mattered. He thought about what would have happened if he had not gone to that auction, if the flyer had blown away from the bus stop before he picked it up, if someone else had bid $71, if Ranger had not scratched at that wall. The chain of small, improbable events that had led from a concrete floor in a storage unit to this moment sitting in the sun on the steps of a building that existed because one dog trusted his nose and one man trusted his dog. He thought about Jerry Whitfield, the frightened brother who had locked the truth in a box and prayed for 30 years that someone would find it. Jerry had called himself a coward, but Ethan knew better now. It takes a particular kind of courage to admit your own weakness, to do what you can, even when you know it is not enough, and to trust that the universe will send someone to finish what you started. Jerry had not been a coward. He had been a man who planted a seed in the dark and died without seeing it grow. And now the seed was a building, and the building was rising from the very ground that Jerry's brother had dreamed of healing. And somewhere, if there was any justice at all in the architecture of eternity, the Whitfield brothers were watching. The sun was setting over the Monongahela River, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The construction site was quiet now. The machines, still the workers gone home to their families to warm dinners and soft couches, and the ordinary miracles of domestic life that Ethan had once taken for granted and would never take for granted again. In the silence, he could hear the river moving, the slow, eternal sound of water, finding its way around obstacles wearing down, resistance, carrying everything eventually, inevitably toward the open sea. A group of children from the neighborhood had been playing on the new green space that afternoon. Ethan had watched them from his office window, chasing each other across the fresh grass, their laughter carrying across the yard like music. One of them, boy of maybe 7 or 8, had broken away from the group and run straight up to Ranger, who was lying in a patch of sunlight near the community center entrance. The boy had thrown his arms around the dog's neck without hesitation, the way children do, and Ranger had sat perfectly still, his tail sweeping slow arcs across the grass, his eyes half closed with contentment. The boy's mother had called out in alarm, but Ethan had waved and said it was fine. The dog was gentle and the mother had relaxed, and the boy had buried his face in Ranger's thick fur and said something that Ethan could not hear from across the yard, but that made the dog's ears perk up and his tail move faster. That was the moment. Not the headline, not the settlement, not the check or the contract or the ceremony. That moment, a child hugging a dog on a patch of green grass that used to be poisoned ground, that was what Danny Whitfield had died for. That was what the truth had bought. Ethan Cole, veteran, formerly homeless, currently employed, looked out at the world he had helped to change and felt something he had not felt since the day he took off his uniform. Not happiness exactly. Happiness is a word for small, bright moments that come and go like sparks from a fire. What Ethan felt was deeper and more permanent than that. It was the knowledge that he had been tested, truly tested the way metal is tested in a furnace, and he had not broken. He had bent. He had cracked. He had come closer to shattering than anyone would ever know. But he had held. And beside him, as always, was the reason. Ranger's amber eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and deep, his body warm against Ethan's leg. The dog was at peace, his work was done for today at least, and tomorrow there would be new perimeters to walk and new people to watch over and new patches of sunlight to lie in while the world rebuilt itself around him. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly where it belonged. The man on the step, the dog at his side, the building behind them, the river before them, the truth finally in the light. And Ethan Cole, who had spent 3 years falling, put his hand on his dog's head and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember that he had finally impossibly gratefully landed.